I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities in Music. On this podcast, Tom and I discuss an array of topics pertaining to modern music, including artist deep dives and monthly and annual new music wrap-ups. Last week, Tom and I kicked off our deep dive into the Beatles' discography, starting with the band's first record, Please Please Me, and progressing over their next 5 records in 3 years, ending with their album Rubber Soul in 1965. This week, Tom and I continue that discussion with part 2 of our deep dive into the Beatles' discography. We'll start with their 7th album, Revolver, and cover all the remaining albums over the course of the later years of the Beatles' discography. Now, before we get started, you can help support Velocities in Music. Subscribe on your favorite podcasting device to automatically get our latest podcast episodes sent to your device each week. Also, Velocities in Music does not want your money. We also don't want to introduce ads into the podcast just yet. Right now, all we want is for you to share Velocities in Music with your family and friends whom you feel would benefit from joining into the music discussion we try to create here every week. So, Tom.
Yes.
The Beatles. Revolver.
Man.
Jump into it, man.
Okay, so first off, right before Revolver came out, we had a couple of singles that really set the stage for this. We had Paperback Writer and Rain, which Rain is one of my favorite Beatles songs.
It's certainly one of the most experimental Beatles tracks.
It is.
Ever.
Ringo's drumming becomes a little bit more all over the place. It's almost jazzier. You also have a nice thunking bass line. It's the first song to incorporate backwards recording into it.
Is thunking a word?
Thunking? It is now, man. I don't know how else to describe that.
It's perfectly descriptive of the bass in Rain.
One thing we talked about with Rubber Soul is Paul McCartney's use of a Rickenbacker bass, and he's still using that now on Paperback Writer, but I guess John Lennon raised a fuss saying that he didn't think that they could hear the bass as well as he wanted it to, so they set up this whole new way of recording bass that I'm not going to get into the details of. Why I think that it's important is they were starting to pay much more close attention to the details of the sound in a way that they couldn't really do when they were just recording live in a room like they were on Please Please Me. They were paying more attention to that stuff, but it also shows that this studio technique was really starting to drive their sound. Paperback Writer and Rain are really good examples of that. Now moving into Revolver as the first album to kind of really embrace this and really just run with it, it's crazy. Now, it's interesting to me, George Harrison has actually said that he sees Rubber Soul and Revolver as being kind of sister albums. Like he sees them as kind of going together. And I can kind of see where he's coming from because they have a much more studio approach. But to me, Revolver is just exponentially more experimental than Rubber Soul was.
Absolutely it is. With the exception of the first track, Taxman, which I feel kind of could be on Rubber Soul. It kind of has that Rubber Soul sound to it with an amazing bass line.
Oh my gosh.
Really beefed up bass line.
Yes.
With the exception of that song, from there you go into Eleanor Rigby, which is like a string orchestration. And from there on, it sounds nothing like anything you heard on Rubber Soul.
Right.
It is vastly more experimental. You have tons of sitar, which was used on the previous record, on the song Norwegian Wood. I still can't say that song title for some reason. But you're seeing a whole different style of the Beatles come out, where they're changing up the way that they structure songs, how they approach the vocals. The lyrics are far and away more experimental on this record than on Rubber Soul. So you're seeing this evolution in hand from the early moments of this record.
Mm-hmm. And the production tactics are just so different. And they're really, this is where they're starting to use production to influence their songwriting.
Yes.
They're writing songs with different production tricks in mind. Rather than using the studio as a way to just get their live performance on tape and onto vinyl for listeners, they're using it as a part of the creative process to facilitate the creative process. Even songs that sound simpler, like Here, There, and Everywhere, which is really just kind of a sweet, ethereal ballad, you listen to how close up the vocals are, how delicate the vocal performance is on that song. That is something they could not have done in their early days.
Making each day of the year, changing my life with a wave of the hand. Nobody can.
You notice on their first 5 albums or so, it kind of sounds like almost every vocal line is being yelled at you. It's being performed very loudly, even for some of their softer tracks, just because it had to be captured that way. Here, they can record the vocals separately. They can use these overdubs to record much more delicate vocal performances. I think that's a great example of that. But really, their songwriting approach is changing a lot too. On For No One, which is another kind of ballad-esque track, you got the horn solo in there, which I think sounds great. And then one track we have to address is Yellow Submarine.
Oh God.
So this is a widely hated Beatles track.
It is?
Yeah,
It's widely hated?
it is.
I thought it was just me.
Do you hate it?
I absolutely. This is probably my least favorite
Really?
Beatles song.
All right.
Mostly because I feel like everyone loves this song, and
Oh, really?
I'm a total hipster, and I'm like, it's really not that good. It's just kind of this sing-song nursery rhyme that's really annoying after a while.
So our friend Tom, not me, Tom K.
Oh wait, your name is Tom.
Yeah, I get that. There are other people named Tom. Did you know that? But Jake, our friend Tom, actually went around and asked a bunch of people for fun what their least favorite Beatles song was, and kept track. And Yellow Submarine was far and away the most documented one. Now, part of that I think is because it's at the forefront of their career. You know, people who only casually know the Beatles usually still know Yellow Submarine, so they clearly haven't listened through the end of Rubber Soul to Run for Your Life, which I hate that song. But Yellow Submarine, I understand the hate because it's kind of tacky. It's not, it's not great, but I don't think the Beatles have any other song like it. And one thing I will defend about it is just the absurd kind of like Lewis Carroll-esque just fun of it, and the whimsy.
Beneath the waves in our yellow submarine, we all live in a yellow submarine, yellow submarine, yellow submarine.
A couple of lines I want to point out too that I think are really brilliant, that I think get overlooked are, first off, the line "in the land of submarines." I think that's some fun wordplay. The land of submarines, they're in the water. The other one is, "Our friends are all aboard. Many more of them live next door." What the hell does that mean? Where is next door if they're in a submarine underwater?
And it's all inclusive. Our friends are all aboard.
Many more of them live next door.
Right.
Like, there are little things like that they're slipping in that I think are really brilliant. Now,
Yeah.
the song as a whole, the presentation of it, I don't think it accomplishes a whole lot on its own, but in the context of the Beatles' work, I think that it's kind of a breath of fresh air.
And perhaps it makes sense to transition from talking about Yellow Submarine then to talking about one of my lesser favorite tracks on the album. On the back half of the record, track 11, Dr. Robert. Tom, just some background. What is this song about?
So this song is about an experience that George and his wife at the time, Patty, and John and his wife at the time, Cynthia, they went over to a friend's place, the Dr. Robert character in the song, and this gentleman slipped some LSD into their drinks, and it was kind of their first experience with that. And George recalls the story as just being kind of a thrilling but terrifying experience, that more drug exposure to them. So, Jake, you mentioned that Dr. Robert is not one of your more favorite tracks on this album. I don't consider it to be a highlight, but I still really like the track.
Absolutely.
But where we see drugs start to influence their songs, in just their general frame of mind, they're also writing songs about drug experiences.
Yes.
There's also Got to Get You Into My Life, the second to last track on this album, and that song Paul actually wrote about marijuana. It's not a love song about a girl like it might sound like it is. It's about wanting to have marijuana in his life at all times. I mean, these guys, they're writing songs dedicated to drug experiences now. But, it doesn't hurt the music. I think that this album is absolutely brilliant and in its variety, but they're still able to albumize it. The tracks are just fantastic. I think that George has some highlights on here too, with Taxman, Love You Too. And then I Want to Tell You, I think is really good. It's not one of my more favorite tracks on the album, but I think it brings some variety.
'Cause I'm the tax man. Yeah, I'm the tax man. If you drive a car, I'll tax the street. If you drive to sit, I'll tax your seat. If you get too cold.
Two of my favorite tracks on the album, Tom, are track 3, I'm Only Sleeping, and track 7, She Said, She Said. Both of those tracks are, She Said has this amazing guitar line in it that I just can't get out of my head.
And Ringo kills it on the drums on that track.
Just the instrumental performance on that track is just the best of the Beatles to date.
I know what it's like to be dead. I know what it is to be sad. And she's making me feel like I've never been born.
I'm Only Sleeping really gets me. That song is a very experimental song, but the lyrics are just spot on, and kind of show the shift that the Beatles are going to as far as experimental notes.
In the middle of a dream, stay in bed, float upstream, please don't wake me, no, don't shake me, leave me where I am, I'm on.
As this album progresses, so thinking about the first 3 tracks of Revolver, you have, Taxman, which, as I said earlier, kind of sounds like it could be straight off of Rubber Soul. It's a nice way to start the album, but then it goes into Eleanor Rigby. And at the time, this song had to have caught every one of their listeners off guard.
Yeah.
It's just, what else out there sounds like Eleanor Rigby? And it's still today a very unique sound for a song to take on. Plus, it's incredibly melodic. And, you cannot listen to Eleanor Rigby and McCartney's, those layered harmonies, but McCartney's driving vocals, and it's just so emotive.
Yeah.
How do you not sing along with that? It's such an impactful track.
Eleanor Rigby is such a standout. Personally, it's my second favorite Beatles song. My first favorite we will be getting to, on a later album, but Eleanor Rigby it hits me every time.
Yep.
And it's not an overly complex song in structure, but the way that they group the vocals with the string sound is just unparalleled.
Yep.
And they hadn't really done anything like it, and they really wouldn't do anything like it again, but it's so stark, and especially coming off of just a kind of a fun jam like Taxman. Wow. Yeah, like you said, Jake, who was ready for that?
Look at all the lovely people. Eleanor Rigby picks up the rice in the church where a wedding has been. Lives in a dream.
And then transitioning from Eleanor Rigby, which is a stark contrast to really any other song, to I'm Only Sleeping, which does have a lot of sonic similarities to some of the other tracks you're going to hear on the record, but really shows the creativity and how they're expanding their sound with the use of different instruments, the more expansive use of instruments like the sitar and guitar, and it's just all the production techniques that go along with it. These guys are experimenting at whole new levels and really pushing the envelope of what they're capable of as songwriters. Now, that also has an impact on their live performance because, Tom, as we mentioned at the end of last week's podcast of part 1 of our deep dive into the Beatles, they were starting to exhaust their ability to play these songs live. And I have to imagine that Revolver is, how could you play Eleanor Rigby live? They didn't.
Right.
They didn't. I don't know if they played many of these songs
This
live.
is the point. So their last actual concert was in 1966 at Candlestick Park. And after that point, that's when they started spending more time in the studio. I think they spent like a solid 3 months or so working on Revolver, which was unheard of for them at that point.
Well, they had had some bad experiences in their tours, like in the Philippines. They had offended.
Oh yeah, terrible experience in the Philippines.
A dignitary, and then they almost got some injuries from fans just mauling them. And
it was becoming not worth it.
Yep, and that's when I think the Beatles made that fundamental choice to cater towards the more highbrow, intelligent fan base and go completely in the studio and leave behind the consumeristic fan base demographic that had appealed to so many people and really caused Beatlemania to occur. Revolver is the exemplification of their choice to move away from the consumer side of their sound into more of the heady sound. And they do it flawlessly. Now, this album was still designed with a number of tracks in it to still kind of be the bridge between their old sound and their new sound, but from here they're going to abandon any pretenses of that consumer sound.
Sure. One track that I think we have to talk about before we move away from Revolver is the closing track, Tomorrow Never Knows.
Absolutely.
This was a groundbreaking track, and I really consider it to be one of the most brilliant tracks I've ever heard.
Yep.
And I'm probably going to keep saying that about several songs in the Beatles' later career, but Tomorrow Never Knows as being kind of this hypnotic Eastern-influenced track, which George Harrison was kind of notorious for bringing a lot of the Indian and Eastern influences into the band, but John really, kind of built on that with Tomorrow Never Knows as well. And what's funny is he was a little uncomfortable with it. He actually titled the track Tomorrow Never Knows after another Ringoism. So Ringo was known within the group as kind of stumbling over phrases and missayings and malapropisms and so on. And
A Hard Day's Night.
Hard Day's Night came from him. 8 Days a Week came from him. And they pulled these turns of phrase because they thought it was funny. And that was just something that was Ringo's. Tomorrow Never Knows was another one of them. And John chose to title the track that because he felt it offset kind of the headiness and the inherent discomfort that he felt from this song being so philosophical, which I think is funny because I actually think the song title Tomorrow Never Knows sounds very philosophical.
It sure does.
It sounds really deep.
Plus, the song is so experimental albeit futuristic that the ending the album with Tomorrow Never Knows as the title of the most experimental and futuristic track that the Beatles have made to date, it's true brilliance, honestly.
Right, because at the core of the song, the chord structure is really, it's just kind of a one chord song at heart, and then you have John Lennon's vocals, which the vocal melody is gorgeous on its own. I mean, you could play this on an acoustic guitar and sing it and it would sound great, but the direction they chose to take it with the beat, with all the crazy tape loops, I mean, I cannot imagine in 1966 putting on this record, hearing it all the way through, already being blown away by the first 13 tracks, and then getting to Tomorrow Never Knows. I mean, that had to have been an unrivaled experience for listeners at the time. There's absolutely nothing else like that. Okay, Jake, so we're wrapping up Revolver. We're moving on to 1967 with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
I just want to say, Tom, that I am immediately intimidated thinking about how we can put to words what this album sounds like and what it accomplishes. Because this is, I think, the climactic point of the Beatles' career as musicians. So
I want to back up a second. Okay. So because we're so intimidated by this, let's approach Sgt. Pepper with a little bit of historical context. So in 1966, I mentioned they played their last show at Candlestick Park. Around that time also was when there was the infamous John Lennon Beatles Are Bigger Than Jesus fiasco.
Right.
That really greatly impacted the band. Now, John Lennon was completely misquoted, well, not necessarily misquoted, but quoted out of context. Right. He was trying to make a statement about the Beatles getting too big, and I think John Lennon in general was the one in the band who had the hardest time coping with that Just mentally, I don't think that John was the kind of person who could deal with it. So actually the way that he dealt with it a lot was just kind of by goofing off. He would go to this surreal place in his mind and he would become kind of a goofball, which I think that people saw as kind of endearing and funny, but I actually think that it came from a kind of a dark like defense mechanism kind of place in John's mind. That's just my kind of speculation, but anyway, the whole bigger than Jesus thing caused a really big kickback from their fans, especially in the southern states in America. A lot of people were demonstrating and burning Beatles paraphernalia and records and stuff. And it made it so that actually by the time they got to their Candlestick Park show, it was not a sold out show, whereas previously it probably would have been. And some of the records that they were putting out, some of the singles were not reaching number one around this time. And it's funny because they were still arguably one of, if not the biggest band in the world at that time, but things had kind of taken a minor step down. And it wasn't like, stifling their creative spirit, but I actually think, if anything, it took kind of a burden off of them. They didn't feel that pressure that they had to keep getting consecutive number one hits. They didn't feel that pressure to keep touring and playing live.
But that work ethic was still there.
Exactly. And the creativity was still there. And they wanted to keep doing that, but they just displaced that energy into their studio efforts. So I think going into the studio in early 1967 to make Sgt. Pepper, I just think that their minds were a lot clearer.
Yeah. Harrison actually left the band for a brief period of time because he just couldn't handle it. And then, they made this decision to stop touring and to focus only on the studio. And that kind of bought the Beatles a few more years.
Yeah.
And their first release of this creativity, this built-up, pent-up creativity that I think that the band hadn't really been able to fully divest over the past few years just because of their touring and release schedule was Sgt. Pepper. Now part of that is, part of like the brilliance. So Sgt. Pepper is one of the greatest records of all time, if not the greatest record of all time. You could easily make a case for it being the greatest record of all time. I'm not here to make that case, but what I will say is that it is a great record, pretty much undeniably so. And I think that it is kind of by chance that they had all the right mixture of ingredients to make it that. All of that obsessive touring without Beatlemania, I don't think Sgt. Pepper could have ever been written.
No, couldn't have.
Because Beatlemania demanded all of these albums, all of this crazy commercial release schedule of having one album in the summer, one album right before Christmas, in the crazy amount of touring that these guys did, which stifled and inherently constrained their creativity, but it also allowed it to build up and build up and build up and build up, and then eventually Sgt. Pepper is just this gigantic burst of creativity, and that's is where they derive the genius for the album. So this is a concept record.
Yeah.
Tom, where does the concept come from?
It's funny because I was actually going to ask you, Jake, if you consider this to be a concept album, and you just answered my question. So that's because there's actually a lot of debate over that.
Wait, it's not a concept record?
Well, it can be argued either way. And here's why. I think that this is key to talk about, because it is a concept record in spirit, but some folks, I don't really see it that way. The way that I see it is absolutely a concept record in terms of its input, in terms of the way that the Beatles approached the construction, songwriting, and recording of this album. I don't think that when you listen to it, it necessarily feels or sounds like a concept record, but them considering it to be is what made it what it is. So I think that it's really important to consider. So the concept that is there is that this is a band that is not them. They get to step outside of themselves, outside of the Beatlemania and all the craziness that the last 5 years or so had offered them, and be someone else.
A bit theatrical.
Exactly. But what's so important to understand is that doing that, while it may not have a huge impact on the way that a casual listener will listen to it, it completely changes the way that the artist approaches the record. So when you're the Beatles and you've been stuck in this, like, keeping up with the Beatles and maintaining this Beatles image for so long, when you give yourself the freedom to say, we're not the Beatles anymore, we're Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, you all of a sudden can start doing things that you really had never considered before. And just a different name can make all the difference. You know, Jake, we recently saw the folks in the Mars Volta move over to being anti-mask. And a lot of people were saying, well, why don't they just go on as the Mars Volta? Well, you have to approach it from the artist's perspective. Changing that name and changing that persona gets rid of all the baggage that you brought with you from previous projects, right? And that's what the Beatles were doing. Now, it actually wasn't intentional. The way that this came about was Paul McCartney just had this song, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and it was kind of a joke, kind of a parody on a lot of the bands at the time that had these big, long names like that, you know, so-and-so and the yada yadas, you know, you have this lead figurehead character and then the backing band. And so he just wrote the opening track, the title track, as a tune to kind of fit this idea. And then they thought, well, wait, what if we took that and we had a whole album of it? And it was like the songs that are being played is being played by this fictional band. And they really only followed that through with the first couple tracks. You know, it transitions into With a Little Help from My Friends, which is sung by Ringo, a.k.a. Billy Shears in that song. They create the character for him. And then in the second to last track, you know, you have the reprise where they bring that song back, and then they say, okay, we've only got one song left, which is kind of traditional for shows and concerts of that time. So, you know, everything in between really could have been any order of songs, any number of songs. You know, they could have fit on other records. They don't really keep that show theme going necessarily with any kind of commentary or dialogue that connects the tracks, but thematically, what it allows them to do is just have a lot of tracks that don't really necessarily make sense with each other, but when you're approaching it from this kind of variety show mindset, then all of a sudden it works. I think that the biggest example of that is moving on when you get to side B, the second side of the record. If you're listening to this on record, the first track of that is Within You, Without You, the one George Harrison song that's on here, which is just a clearly Eastern influenced, you know, kind of sitar and drum based song, very atmospheric and so on. And it transitions perfectly somehow into When I'm 64, which is this just kind of hokey Paul McCartney song that just kind of steps all over itself. But they don't even put any space in between those tracks. They just move right from one to the other. I think in any normal context, those two songs wouldn't even make sense on the same album together, let alone right next to each other, let alone transitioning directly from the last note of the first track to the second note of When I'm 64. It doesn't make sense, but on Sgt. Pepper, they make it work.
The time will come when you see we're all one, and life flows on within you and without you. When I get older, losing my hair, many years from now.
I think a lot of that has to do with the grand production of every one of these tracks. You saw in Revolver these guys start to experiment with adding a much bigger, more lush sound, specifically in the track I'm Only Sleeping, which I mentioned earlier. But in this album, on Sgt. Pepper, you have the most lush compositions you hear throughout the Beatles' career.
Yeah.
It is you know, full orchestration on some of these tracks. You know, I think that if you go to the last song on side A of the record, Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite, which is a very trippy Lennon-led song that is, you know, really a circus act. And it's describing a circus.
He got the influence from a circus poster, and all the names in the song, all the acts were on this poster, and he just pulled them into it.
And it's very surreal but real at the same time, because it really takes you into to like the circus environment, right? And the way that they're doing that is they're including all of these sounds and I don't know, like are they even samples this day and age? I mean, because they're using like real sounds to back some of the main instruments, and you hear like a crowd applauding in the background and things like that. Like it feels like you're witnessing this act, and the narrator is just singing to you the narration of the act.
Sure, the public public, their production will be second to none. And of course, Henry the Horse dances the waltz.
One track that I think is one of the underrated gems of the Beatles discography is on here, and that is track 6, She's Leaving Home.
Absolutely.
That song is gorgeous. The harp is beautiful. I love the lyrics and the message that it tells about the girl running away. The performance is just gorgeous. I find it to be a truly moving song that for some reason I don't hear people talking about much.
We gave her most of our lives. Is leaving. Sacrificed most of our lives. We gave her everything money could buy. She's leaving home after living alone for so many years.
One thing I want to say about Sgt. Pepper is I don't think it actually has a lot of the Beatles' stronger tracks. I think that if you were doing a track-by-track comparison of like Sgt. Pepper and Revolver, I think Revolver has stronger tracks.
I would agree with you there.
But I think that Sgt. Pepper somehow feels so much more complete to me as a whole album. There aren't a lot of tracks that actually stand out to me as my favorite Beatles tracks until you get to the end with A Day in the Life, which not only is it my favorite Beatles song, period, I consider it to be probably the most brilliant recording in music history. I think it is absolutely genius. The way that they blend, the John Lennon part, which is very dark, with the Paul McCartney section of the song, which is a little more up-tempo and brighter, and they make them flow between those parts, and then with the orchestral climax of the track, and the big piano key or chord at the end, that song just moves me near to tears every time I listen to it, just because of the sheer brilliance that it took to construct every piece of it. I can't even fathom anyone ever writing something that comes that close.
Made the bus in seconds flat. Found my way upstairs and had a smoke. And somebody spoke and I went into a dream.
Now, a lot of these tracks are right around, 3 minutes long, give or take 15 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
And, Tom, as you said earlier, they're very much a product of being together on the same album. That's what enhances all the tracks. Individually, there's a lot of standout tracks here. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds is probably the biggest standout track from this standalone track from this album. But also you have tracks like Getting Better, which everyone I think knows. Lovely Rita is a McCartney song that I can't get enough of. But also Good Morning, Good Morning is another track that I think are clear standouts.
I love Good Morning, Good Morning. That song is fun. It's got a really interesting structure. I will actually say Lovely Rita and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds are actually two of my least favorite tracks from this album. And I think that I'm in the minority on that. They're still good songs. I'm never going to skip them when I put this album on, but it just goes to show, at least for me, this is about listening to the whole album. This album, it does have some highlights. It does have some standouts, but I think that's what makes it go down in history, is what it accomplishes as one cohesive piece of music.
And part of what they did from a production standpoint is, instead of allowing like the normal pause in between tracks, they really shortened that up. One thing that I noticed when I listened to this record is that while they are designed to be individual tracks, they produced this album in a way that the songs cut into one another very fast. So it keeps the rhythm and the cadence of each song flowing into one another. That is a genius trick, an album structure trick that we've talked about in album reviews in the past, Tom, that the Beatles, I think, are stumbling upon here. And it works so well because this album never gives you a chance to just sit and breathe and think about like what you're experiencing. It's so surreal at different points and so lush throughout the record, and it never gives you a chance to think about what's happening around you. You just move to the next track, and then you have all these new ideas that you have to process, and then all of a sudden you're at the next track processing all that bevy of ideas that are being thrown at you. You don't ever get to reflect on it until you get to a day in the life. But then you're being like pulled in an undertow of just genius songwriting. And then the album ends, and it's an overwhelming experience. You finish this record and you don't know what to listen to next because nothing sounds as complex or as nourishing as Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
Mm-hmm.
Moving on from Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, later on in 1967, late November 1967, the Beatles released a double EP or an LP in the United States.
What is a double EP? What is the point of a double EP? How is it not just an LP at that point?
I think
you just
it's
split it to 2 discs for no reason.
I think it's like like a sub bullet of additive identity that 2 EPs equals an LP.
Right. That should just be part of like an general understanding.
Right. So this does bring up a bit of a hairy thing for us to address, Tom, is that we've been following the UK version of the Beatles discography, and so therefore I don't think Magical Mystery Tour is really considered to be a Beatles record.
That's dumb.
But
let's skip that.
But in the States here, like, it clearly is. So we're being a bit hypocritical in how we're following this. But a double EP, we're just going to equate to an album.
Right. Well, and I think part of it too is Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane had already been released as singles. Yeah. And this is one of the, rare occasions where kind of a non-album single then came back to an album. They decided to include it here. But there also was the Magical Mystery Tour film, which was a shorter film for them. But that was, created and released around the same time. And here, we're seeing them take the theatrical aspects of Sgt. Pepper, and they're really just putting it on steroids. I mean, this album is over the top. It's extravagant. It's extremely colorful. And here, I would say that the experimentation. The songs are still great on here. This is actually still one of my favorite Beatles albums, but I feel like the experimentation becomes a little less focused. It's a little more just around the edges and a little bit self-indulgent, but the songwriting driving it is still really solid. In particular, the title track starting it off with Magical Mystery Tour, I mean, to use this word again, kind of a whimsical concept, right. But they make it work just because they're brilliant performers and brilliant songwriters. You move from that into Fool on the Hill, which is a little darker of a tune for McCartney. Still a great track, actually probably one of my more favorite Beatles tracks. So this album is a little bit all over the place. Of course, it reaches its apex, I think, at I Am the Walrus, which is a very notable Beatles track. That's kind of, I see it as John Lennon giving the middle finger to everyone who had overanalyzed his lyrics and really thought too hard about what he was trying to do, just saying, here, analyze this. It's a bunch of gibberish. But it's still a brilliant song. It's still a lot of fun to listen to. It's got a really pointed mood to it.
But wait, he didn't want. He was pointing the middle finger at over analysis, but yet this is the song where he hid the subtext of Paul's death.
Oh yeah, right.
Interesting. He would try something that.
Yeah, I forgot. I think historically we should point out that actually at this point Paul's been dead for a few years now.
He's been dead. They replaced him with a guy who looks and sounds
Billy
better
Shears.
Billy Shears, obviously, and they renamed him Paul McCartney, and then no one knows.
Right. The whole Paul is dead thing is its own tangent, but
kind of funny though.
Right. But Magical Mystery Tour, I actually think it's a little bit of a raw deal. I think it gets overlooked a lot. I consider it to be a really fantastic album. It doesn't feel as complete as Sgt. Pepper, doesn't feel as well-rounded, but I just think that there are a lot of highlights on here.
Absolutely. And really the back half of the record, or side 2 of the record, which is the 1967 singles, you have, tracks like Hello, Goodbye and Strawberry Fields Forever are just Beatles classics. They really, they kind of personify the flower power hippie movement of the late 60s at this point. And actually the last track on the record, All You Need Is Love, was considered the anthem of flower power. And you know, it's a very, you know, well-rounded statement to make that all you need is love. The Beatles were starting to take on this legendary status, right? You know, they had you know, created Beatlemania and then had created Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which was at this point in time the greatest record ever made. And you know, these guys are on top of the world, and then they make a statement like all you need is love that a whole movement is based around.
Which I think that the whole hippie movement actually kind of bastardized that. So George Harrison actually went to Haight-Ashbury where all the, you know, Summer of Love stuff was going on, and he was actually completely disenchanted with what was going on there because he's like, it's just a bunch of people doing drugs and not accomplishing anything. So I think that puts kind of a bad name on that whole movement.
Are you calling hippies unproductive? How dare you?
Right.
The nerve.
I know, man. It's heresy. You know where I'm coming from. No, but really, you know, what they were putting into it and the message they were trying to make with their music, with All You Need Is Love, is really potent, and I think it still rings true today. While there was a lot more social and cultural context for it to be examined through back then, you know, today I still think it's a really strong song and a really powerful one.
Favorite tracks on this record, Tom?
For me, Hello Goodbye is a great one. I think that Your Mother Should Know is a really often overlooked track. I think that one has a really strong melody and kind of a spooky vibe underneath it. Mm-hmm. I like it when the Beatles do kind of a dual-natured track like that, where just the way that the lyrics and melody work with the underlying chord progressions and instrumentation to create almost kind of a friction. Mm-hmm. I like that. I almost like that kind of sense of discomfort because as pop musicians, but very smart ones, they really killed it on that level.
Let's all get up and dance to a song that was a hit before your mother was born. Though she was born a long, long time ago, your mother should know.
I really love the Fool on the Hill on side A of this album for all the reasons you stated earlier, Tom, but also on the single side of the record, side B, Strawberry Fields Forever. The lyric, living is easy with eyes closed, has stuck with me over the years and has really kind of made an impact on my life. So I just naturally love that song. It's become like one that we play all the time.
Living is easy with eyes closed. Misunderstanding all you see. It's getting hard to be someone, but it all works out. It doesn't matter.
So moving on from Magical Mystery Tour, we've got some singles that happened in 1968. So 1967, end of 1967 is when Magical Mystery Tour is released. In early 1968, we have a single like Lady Madonna. A little later is Hey Jude. You know, these singles, I don't feel like, while Hey Jude is a really, you know, epic song, in melodic structure and approach, it's actually fairly simple. It's just kind of extended. You know, Lady Madonna is a really good kind of upbeat piano rock track. I don't feel like with either of these songs, they're necessarily moving their sound forward all that drastically, but I think it takes some of the hazy psychedelics off of what they were doing with Magical Mystery Tour and really kind of grounding it into just the rock that would become the White Album later in 1968.
Good money was heaven sent. Friday night arrives without a suitcase. Sunday morning creeping like a nun. Monday's child has learned to tie his bootlace. See how they run.
So, Tom, what were some events that occurred in early 1968 that influenced the change that
Sure.
the Beatles were going through? I mean, at this point in time, the Beatles had conquered the musical world. They had quit touring. They had, a huge success in the early years, and then had released Sgt Pepper, and then had this, very, very successful stint with all the singles that came with Magical Mystery Tour. And where does the band, as the band has developed to this point, they're at the top of the world, the top of the musical world. Where do they go from here?
Well, from there, they were doing a lot of business activity, like opening up Apple and the Apple boutique and the store that went along with it. So they were trying to become kind of more official businessmen, but they also spent a lot of time in Rishikesh, India, with the Maharishi doing the whole transcendental meditation stuff, which really kind of changed their view on things. They also wrote a lot of music over there. Dear Prudence, which would be the second track on the White Album, was written about Mia Farrow's sister and how she wouldn't leave her room while they were in India. Sexy Sadie was about the Maharishi himself. Even like Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except Me and My Monkey is kind of inspired by some things that he would say. So it really came into this album a lot, but I think that they were a very conflicted group at this point, because before they started making the White Album, they were in India, but they weren't really there for the same amounts of time. Some of them came back earlier than the others, and they were just becoming a little more fragmented and isolated, which doesn't really necessarily make for a good music experience. Now, they still were able to make the White Album, but it started with a lot of turmoil. Ringo left the group for a couple weeks because he wasn't really feeling appreciated. He eventually did rejoin, and I guess they put flowers on his drum set to welcome him back. And he did say that, after that, things were a lot better. They felt a lot tighter, and they were able to finish the White Album all right. But in terms of writing, I mean, the White Album really marks the probably least amount of collaboration when it comes to the actual songwriting and finishing of these songs. This album really feels more like a collection of solo tracks from each of them that they brought together, but it still just manages to kick complete ass. I mean, this album is so good, and as a double album, I mean, it's all over the place. But this is really where you see, despite them getting a little more isolated, they're still kind of coming together with the general direction of the band, but a lot of the business practices and personal things going on outside of the studio or even inside the studio, like with Yoko Ono coming into the picture, John Lennon not wanting to leave her side, her coming into the studio with them, made the rest of the band uneasy. These personal things are starting to affect the way they make music and the way that they actually construct albums. So we're really seeing those things become less separate. Because in their early days, I mean, they were together all the time, and they were a very tight-knit group of friends. I mean, when you're touring constantly, you're not away from each other, and there's not really even time for your personal life to affect your professional life on the road. But here, as they were getting more powerful in what they could do and how much artistic freedom they had, there was more time for them to grow apart, for them to be more interested in their families, and for them to just kind of stop getting along and stop being into it.
Musically, it was very tough for the Beatles at this point in time to become more experimental than what they had already become.
Yeah.
Just with the technology available to them at the time, they had really pushed the envelope as far as it could go. So now it was really an approach of songwriting. How can they experiment with songwriting to the point that they could really, create something new and exciting? And that I have to just empathize with them. That had to be just crazy, daunting, and challenging.
Yeah.
In my head, the White Album and the amalgamation of tracks that you hear on the White Album show how just disjointed and scatterbrained they are. This album to me almost it's like the sounds that I hear are musical representation of all the discord that's going on in the Beatles as a team, as a group of people, and it tells a story, honestly. And I think that's part of the beauty of the record is that this thing is huge. It's it's a true double album. It has 4 sides to the original record, and as you said earlier, it's more just a collection of individual tracks than it is a cohesive record. The Lennon-McCartney songwriting duo was starting to splinter with those guys taking more of an individual approach and John becoming much more critical of Paul's songs. He starts this criticism, this ongoing criticism of John's music being granny music with tracks like Obla Di Obla Da, and you can kind of get that Magoo sense from tracks like Obla Di Obla Da, just with the playfulness of the lyrics. But that's also where the charm of some of the records are, and the whole getting into the whole Lennon-McCartney songwriting duo, which we talked a little bit about in our duos podcast, Tom. Yeah. But this songwriting duo was really a match made in heaven. These two, Lennon was so out there, even from the early days. He was always more experimental, always a bit more surreal, and McCartney was always so playful, so much more down to earth. And the way that they would write songs together would completely balance out the eccentric sides of their personalities, and it made for a really nice blend of their styles. As they start to separate, the songs get more and more visceral on Lennon's side, and they get more and more Magoo on the McCartney side. And if you go and listen to McCartney's second studio album, Ram, it's pretty much all that granny Magoo stuff.
But it's brilliant.
Yeah. But it takes that you have to be into that sound.
And also, you listen to John Lennon's solo album, Plastic Ono Band, and it's all the visceral darkness.
Yeah, emotional.
Right.
The first true emo album, honestly.
Right. And that's, the White Album really does feel like a blend of those two, but not really within tracks. It's very kind of track by track. But for me, I'll come out and say this is my favorite Beatles album. Just from the sheer cross-section of quality and quantity. No, it does not flow. It does not. But it doesn't try to. It's a collection of songs that I just find to be absolutely brilliant. We also have the first Ringo penned song with Don't Pass Me By.
A great track.
Which has kind of a country honk feel to it, but it's a great track.
Works well with his vocals.
Yeah, it does.
Pass me by, don't make me cry, don't make me blue. 'Cause darling, I love only you. You'll never know it hurt me so. I'll hate to see you go, don't pass me by.
George Harrison's songs on here are highlights, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, which Eric Clapton is featured on guitar as. Those two were good friends, and Eric Clapton was a continual influence on George Harrison's guitar playing and songwriting. So that friendship was also shaping the band.
Look at you all, see the love that's sleeping. While my guitar gently weeps.
Despite some of the unrest within the group, you still had a lot of fun moments on here. Wild Honey Pie, track 5 on, the first side of the album, where they're kind of in advance making fun of Honey Pie, which would come near the end of the second disc of the album. That's kind of fun. You also have in George Harrison's track Savoy Truffle, which is a highlight for me, you have him say, "We all know Obla Di Bla Da." They're self-referential. I mean, they're referencing tracks, at other parts of the album. It's this huge experience.
It's a subtle albumization strategy.
It is. I have to point out the trifecta of While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Happiness is a Warm Gun, and Martha, My Dear. Those 3 tracks in a row blow me away. Happiness is a Warm Gun is, it starts kind of dark and creepy sounding. It then just goes into this big rock climax that's just so uplifting. And I think it's also a highlight of some of John's more out there lyricism.
I need a fix 'cause I'm going down to the bits that I left uptown. I need a fix 'cause I'm going down.
And then Martha, My Dear, we go into more of the kind of hokey Paul McCartney stuff, but that song is brilliantly written. The piano movements, then when you get to the horns at the end, the structure is very fresh, very interesting, great performance.
I agree with you completely on those 3 tracks. The clear highlight of the album, that's kind of to me the heart of the album. To me, it's so hard to say. Like I've only listened to this double album as like disc 1 and disc 2, but from a vinyl perspective, there's 4 sides to this. So on the first half of the double album, I really prefer over the second half of the double album.
That's
there's
fair.
a number of really great tracks on the second half, but I feel like the first half works much better as a record. I love kicking it off with Back in the USSR, and then Dear Prudence I think is an absolute genius track. And those 3 tracks that you were talking about, Tom, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, obviously is very grand and accomplishes a ton. Happiness is a Warm Gun. One thing I would add to everything that you said is that this song actually was the inspiration for one of my favorite Radiohead tracks, which is Paranoid Android, in that it was 3 songs that were stitched together to make something bigger than in 3 individual songs.
But they make it work so well, and it's so smooth.
And that's going to come into play even more, that tactic that they employed on their self-titled White Album record when we talk about Abbey Road here in a bit. Martha, My Dear, is to me one of the most geniusly written Beatles tracks ever, and I can't stop listening to that song even after hearing it hundreds of times.
Forget me, Martha, my dear. Hold your head up, you silly girl. Look what you've done.
Blackbird, another great song, but the record closes off side 2 or part 1 of the 2 double albums with I Will and then Julia, which is the Lennon acoustic guitar song that is just absolutely beautiful.
Windy smile calls me, so I sing the song of love, Julia.
Great closing track for that side. They kick it back in with Birthday on side 1 of disc 2, I should say. And then Your Blues, which I feel like that's kind of where the band starts to feel a little more cohesive and gelled again. With Your Blues is a good kind of rockin' track. One thing I have to point out that I think is brilliant about Your Blues is when, it's this kind of like, almost jokingly, like satirically angsty song. And I love when John Lennon goes, even hate my rock and roll. And when he says that, the sound shifts from being a blues rock song to be kind of a swing song. And I mean, whenever someone can match lyrics to the actual musical styling, I just think that takes it to the next level. Then you have a little bit later Helter Skelter, which to me is like one of the epitomal like proto-metal songs. I mean, Paul's vocal performance on that track is mind-blowingly good, and it's heavy. That is a heavy track, man. It rocks the hell out. Really sets the stage for a lot of the heavier stuff that would happen in the last year of the 60s and then on into the early 70s. One thing that we have to address is Revolution 9, the second to last track on the whole album, which is basically just John Lennon experimenting with tape loops and such for like over 8 minutes. This is, a point of contention. A lot of people don't like this track, and I would say it's hard to argue that it's really a great Beatles song because melodically and rhythmically there's not really much there. It's sound experimentation, and I think for that purpose it fits the album well. But more importantly, I think that what Revolution 9 does is set up the last track, Good Night, which is a very, very kind of like classical lounge-sounding track sung by Ringo.
It's a lullaby.
Which was a perfect choice to have Ringo sing it. Sounds very kind of otherworldly. But to close this monumental album with this just batshit crazy experimental song, and then go into this sugary, sweet lullaby track sung by none other than Ringo. It is just such a contrast, and I think that right there really summarizes what the White Album is all about.
Now it's time to say goodnight, sleep tight.
Now, George Harrison and George Martin and even Ringo have gone on record as saying that the White Album probably could have and maybe should have been trimmed down to like one record that was just really good. Paul goes against that and says, it's the Beatles' White Album, it's great, shut up. I gotta say, I have to side with Paul on that. And I think the reason it works as a double album is because none of these songs step on each other's toes. Like, I mean, really, try to trim 15 songs. Pick 15 songs that you could trim from this album that it would still work the same as the Beatles' White Album. I don't think you could do it. I just think that even some of the lesser tracks, they bring variety and bring that personality to the record that makes the White Album what it is.
And I think that its beauty is in its imperfection.
Yeah.
And it really summarizes a time of the Beatles. And I think that that's kind of another important facet of it, is that because it's so indicative of where the Beatles were in their careers and their personal lives, and it's reflected so much in the music, that story that it tells that's the endearing part of the White Album. Mm-hmm. And so I will agree with you and at the same time disagree with you, because there's part of me that just, like, I can't get through Revolution 9, and so I don't get to appreciate how they end the album quite as well. And you know, there is that part of me that wonders, you know, what if they had made just this really tight sounding stellar record, because, you know, and this will transition well into the final two records of Abbey Road and Let It Be. But you know, I've always wondered, like, what it would be like if, like, the Get Back sessions, which we'll talk about a bit here in a bit, but if those would have been a complete listening experience, what it would have been. But the Beatles had done that. They had OD'd on the complete listening experience at this point, after making the three polished records of Rubber Soul, Revolver, and Sgt Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, releasing a bunch of just stellar singles, ascending the top of the musical world. And then what do you do from there? Like I said earlier, they had no other choice but to just let their creativity explode and allow all of those personal relationships and that turmoil to come out a bit in their music. The White Album is that representation.
So just a couple months, really, just a few short months after the White Album was released, we have Yellow Submarine, which is, we're just going to touch on, it doesn't really feel like a real Beatles record.
I don't consider it to be one.
Right, it's more just the soundtrack to the Yellow Submarine film, which is a really crazy, kooky, animated film. So very, very pointed reasons why I don't really consider this to be an album. If it is a Beatles album, if we're considering that, it's easily my least favorite. But first off, two of the tracks we've already heard, probably, you know, two of the best tracks on the album we've already heard on other Beatles albums. Yellow Submarine was originally on Revolver, and All You Need Is Love was originally on Magical Mystery Tour. And those are the beginning and end, respectively, of side A of the record. If I want to hear either of those songs, I'm probably just going to go listen to Revolver and Magical Mystery Tour. Now, from there, you have 4 songs sandwiched in between: Only a Northern Song, All Together Now, Hey Bulldog, and It's All Too Much. It's All Too Much and Only a Northern Song are George Harrison tunes. They're okay. They're
very
fine,
experimental.
but
they sound like they're from a soundtrack.
Right, exactly. All Together Now is another hokey Paul McCartney tune. It's
more
okay,
that granny
but
shit.
Not great, really. I don't feel ever any need to listen to that track.
Right.
Really, the only highlight from this album is Hey Bulldog.
Yes.
Hey Bulldog is a standout track. It is very good. It was recorded about a year prior to the release of Yellow Submarine in with the Lady Madonna sessions. And that, to me, Hey Bulldog is the only reason to listen to this album.
Right.
Don't know what it's like to listen to your fears. You can talk to me. You can talk to me. You can talk to me. If you're lonely, you can talk to me.
Side B is comprised of the film score that George Martin composed, which is fine. It's not bad, but I don't know. Do you ever go out of your way to listen to those tracks, Jake?
No, I go out of my way not to listen to them.
Right, there you go. They just kind of droll along, and it's for the sake of the film.
Yeah.
I don't really ever feel compelled to listen to this album, except for revisiting Hey Bulldog from time to time, because it's a great track. So really, I think that's all there is to say about Yellow Submarine. Moving on from there, in early 1969, we move into the Get Back sessions, which would eventually come a year later to be the album Let It Be. So the Get Back sessions, the idea behind this is, the band, there was increasing friction within the band because of their personalities changing, their personal lives changing.
The fame.
The fame, the business aspect of it, and clashes primarily between John and Paul about that piece of it. And what they really wanted to do is they wanted to recapture kind of the spirit of their early days, which is why Get Back is really an apt title. They're thinking, well, what if we get studio space and we write some songs and
stripped down,
and
less experimental, and they actually early on had a goal of performing live.
Right, they wanted to perform all these new songs live at a big concert and record it, and it would be a live album of new material, which is a really unique idea. And sometimes I think artists need to force themselves to write in a different context or with a different purpose in order to get some new creative juices flowing. Well, this idea didn't really come to fruition in the same way. They didn't end up doing that, big concert and recording it, but they got the studio space. They started crafting some songs and they started recording them. It would eventually become Let It Be. We'll get back to that in a little bit. But one thing that I want to note that they did is they brought in Billy Preston to play the keys on some of these tracks. And that really changed the dynamic. As they said, it's kind of like, if you're having a disagreement with friends, or maybe you're in an argument with your wife, and then, you have some people come over, you kind of put on a face and you get along for the sake of these new people that are introduced into the environment, right? And I think that Billy Preston coming in really forced the Beatles to try to get along a little bit more and work together. And I think that the songs that they made from those sessions were great. While I don't think it really recaptured anything that they had done early on, I also think that it was set apart from some of the studio stuff they were crafting. But we'll talk about that more when we get to Let It Be. That whole project was kind of stalled because it wasn't really turning out how they wanted it to.
Yeah, the Get Back sessions, Tom, they were just a disaster. Like, the band has members of the band has since described the Get Back sessions as hell on earth. It's several members of the band. In fact, to be perfectly honest, the chronological timeline of how it all went down is very hard to follow because it's very complex and happened in a very short amount of time. Essentially, several members of the band quit and rejoined at certain points, and really, they just did a ton of recording, very simple songs that would eventually form Let It Be later on. But they essentially just, it was like watching a train crash, and really a low point for the band. The band at this point, was in absolute disarray. These guys hated each other, and it didn't look good for the Beatles. They abandoned the sessions and then moved on.
And that is really where we come to later in 1969 with the creation of Abbey Road. I think at that point they really didn't even know if they would get back together for another album, but they had material for it. They decided to give it another go, and this was kind of their big farewell. And from what George Martin has said, he was kind of surprised that they chose to do this because there was just so much tension within the group. But George Martin actually recalls it as being a very happy, pleasant record to make, and I think it's because they knew that it was coming to a close.
Right.
When this has been going on for so long and they've given their entire lives to this band, it can seem like there's no end in sight, and I think that mentally can really affect you. I think once they really came to the realization that this would be their last go, I think at that point you're able to suck it up, put differences aside, and really just go out with a bang, and boy did they ever with Abbey Road.
Yeah, Abbey Road started with Paul McCartney again. So during those failed Get Back sessions, that kind of had that whole idea of recording a live album of new material and wanting to get back to their roots. That was an idea that Paul had. And so keep in mind, so historically, if you look at the bigger picture here, you have the Beatles kind of coming to a halt in the White Album. They released this album, but it was kind of, the reason why it was such a huge release was because they didn't want to deal with it anymore. They were at their wits' end, right? So they just released it as is. They didn't try to polish it up or anything and spend that extra effort to polish it up. Still came off as a brilliant record, but then where do they even go from there, right? So Paul has this idea. He doesn't want the band to end. He's committed to the Beatles as a band, and so he announces this idea for the Get Back sessions. It goes terribly. And then he still doesn't want the Beatles to just be over. So he proposes the idea, kind of similar to Get Back, but this time we're getting back to how we used to write songs together.
Yeah.
And they want to make another studio album, and so they invite George Martin in, and George Martin's completely surprised, and then they decide to start recording sessions for Abbey Road as a full band. So for the first few months, I think it goes all right? Mm-hmm. They record a number of tracks. Now, there is still some hostility in the band. I think, some of the band members have said that this is a more pleasant experience, but I think Lennon and McCartney's relationship was very
strained
at this point. At one point, somebody had proposed that they make this one moving piece of music, and Lennon just completely rejected that idea because he actually wanted all of his songs on one part of the record and all of Paul's songs on the other record. I mean, if that doesn't say strained relationship, I don't know what does. And you still have songs being credited to Lennon and McCartney, which is just a strange duality there. So anyways, the song, the recording session ends kind of abruptly. They were recording I Want You, She's So Heavy.
Yeah.
And that was a very, honestly, that's my favorite Beatles song. And it's a very simple song, but it rocks so hard and accomplishes so much with so little lyrics that I think it's a very monumental song. It's a Lennon song that is like almost 8 minutes long, but it cuts off at 7 minutes and 44 seconds because Lennon said, let's cut it right here. And then that ends side A of Abbey Road. And I think that's just a brilliant way of ending that huge self-indulgent track. At the end of recording that song, though, that's really the last time we see these guys together in the studio. At that point, Lennon leaves the band, and the rest of the members of the band take the pieces and try to finish it up and release the album.
It still comes together brilliantly. I mean,
I see what you did there, Tom.
Oh, God, I didn't even try to do that one. You're giving me too much credit with these jokes. But it still feels like probably, I'm trying to check myself, but possibly their most cohesive album. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that has to do with the whole medley concept on side B. I mean, that is just... It's just brilliant what they do with that. Also, I want to point out, we got another Ringo track with Octopus's Garden, which isn't everyone's favorite track, but I think it plays its part well on here. We have a couple of really good George Harrison tunes with Something, which to me is one of the best love songs ever written.
Yep.
Paul is... listen back to that track. Paul is basically just soloing on the bass the whole time. The bass line is nuts. But then also with Here Comes the Sun, George was always good about providing that optimism within the group, even when John was kind of, being a little more nihilistic and crazy. But George was really good at balancing that out. I also want to point out Maxwell's Silver Hammer, track 3, which is kind of a goofy song, but it's like a goofy song about murder. And I love when bands do this. I mentioned this earlier, where there's this like really dual nature between the lyrics, where if you just read the lyrics by themselves, you would get such a different tone than the way they're presented with the rest of the music. And I think that was a really, really smart, deliberate choice on their part.
Bang, bang, Maxwell Silver Hammer came down upon her head. Bang, bang, Maxwell Silver Hammer made sure that she was dead.
But then you get to the end of the record with The End, which is basically the Beatles' goodbye to all of their listeners. which is a really profound moment and a really great song to boot. Abbey Road, while it's actually not one of my, well, it's in my top 5. I think a lot of people would put it in their top 1 or 2. I still love it. But for me, it's just some of these tracks they don't stick out in my mind as much. And a lot of it's because this is an album listen, man. It's not necessarily about individual tracks. You mentioned She's So Heavy. That is a phenomenal track. I also want to call out Oh Darling as being probably, once again, checking myself, but one of, if not the best vocal performances by Paul McCartney. He just destroys it on that song, and it's fantastic.
Tom, I got to be honest with you. I've always wondered if you are right in the head.
Because this isn't my more favorite Beatles album?
This is far and away my favorite Beatles record. And a lot of people will say that Sgt. Pepper is the best Beatles record or their favorite, and I think that that's a totally valid argument. But I just far and away love Abbey Road for so many reasons. I think, first of all, it is a rock record, where the rest of the Beatles music, I don't know if you can really define as rock. Abbey Road is a rock record. It is, and keep in mind, 1969, this is really when rock and roll was really taking hold.
Yeah.
It was becoming this big thing, and the Beatles had become a rock band. Their last true record is a rock record, and I think that that's pretty cool, as I'm a huge fan of rock and roll music. But in addition to that, you have the fact that it is a true album experience, even with the fact that, side A of this record is mostly just single songs that could be considered singles, and then the second half is really the medley. It flows perfectly as one piece of cohesive music, and the songs flow in together perfectly. I mentioned earlier, I Want You, She's So Heavy being my favorite track on the album. The only reason that song works so well, especially at its 7, almost 8-minute track length, the only reason that song works is because of all the songs around it.
Yeah.
The fact that they structured that in the middle of the record, at the immediate end of side A, and the way it transitions to Here Comes the Sun, it's just brilliant. Like, these guys, not only were they at this point in their careers writing genius songs in ways nobody else could, or maybe even can since, they're also structuring albums in ways that nobody even can fathom. And I just think it's absolute genius.
Well, what's interesting too is think about not just number of tracks, but how much space on the album the tracks occupy. I Want You, She's So Heavy is about as long as the last 7 tracks on the album combined. Because, there's the shorter, kind of more medley-based tracks. But, Jake, if you didn't think that I was right in the head before, you're surely not going to now. But I have to say, the opening track, Come Together, overrated. I don't think that it's all that great of a Beatles
We're done.
track.
I quit. I'm leaving.
I've got my reasons for it. I love the bass line. I like the drum part. I like those little more rock out interludes where the lead guitar comes back in.
Who are you?
But the verses just bore me. The vocal melody is so repetitive, and I still think it's a good song, but in context of the Beatles, I actually think it's one of the weaker tracks on this album.
But while the vocal melody is repetitive, the lyrics are so biting and good.
Yeah. But it's just, it just gets me into this kind of sing-songy, like, sleep pattern. I don't know.
I hear something sinister in the opening track, and I think that it kicks off the album with such an attitude, which is perfectly contrasted by the sweetness of Something and its mastery at each individual performance in that song, and then the goofiness of Maxwell's Silver Hammer. Oh Darling, I think, gets back to a little bit of their roots in the early days, but also adds like that huge rock edge with the big guitars in that song. Octopus is Garden. Ringo's, his contribution is absolutely beautiful and playful, and honestly is as granny as anything that McCartney did. But then I Want You, She's So Heavy is the ultimate rock song, rock and roll song from this era. And then, the back half, when we talked about Here Comes the Sun, but the song we haven't talked about is Because.
That song is amazing.
It is amazing. It's amazing not only in its performance, but also in how it was written. So Because was a song that Lennon wrote, and he got the idea for the song he was laying on a couch listening to Yoko Ono play Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, and then he asked her to reverse the chords. And then that is how he wrote the chord structure for Because, which is mostly a vocal-based song. You just have one distorted electric guitar line, which is haunting and creepy to boot. But then you have the huge amount of layered, harmonized vocals that are like bone-chilling.
Yeah.
And then that I don't know if it's either a very processed guitar or a very synthesized melody that's going on there, but towards the end of this track, but like the track takes you to another world.
Yeah, it really does.
And defines that psychedelic sound that the Beatles had established, but it takes it to a whole new level. And the fact that they were even considering doing that on their rock album, which and also their last album, I think is just so monumental. And then the medley at the end is just a genius way to end the record. To me, this is fundamentally from a performance-based standpoint, from a songwriting-based standpoint, maybe not their most ambitious, but they're certainly their best written and performed record, which is why it's my favorite.
Because the world is round, it turns me on.
Yeah, it's so cohesive. It's such a true statement. And I think that part of the reason this is your favorite album of theirs and not mine is because one thing that I've noticed, I think that you and I listen for very differently, Jake, is I think you are even much more sensitive to the album listening experience than I am.
I absolutely am.
While it's something we both care about, and while we also both want to have highlight tracks on albums, I think I tend to lean more towards albums that have highlight tracks, whereas you are way more about that continuous listening experience.
Totally true. Well, Tom, I think that about wraps up our diagnosis and deep dive into Abbey Road, the Beatles' second to last album. There's their last recorded album, which came out in 1969. Now, in 1970, their official last record was released, which is Let It Be.
Yeah.
And fundamentally, what Let It Be is the finished version of the Get Back sessions, which occurred in 1968, predating the Abbey Road sessions.
Right, so we're pretty far removed now, time-wise, from when these sessions actually happened.
For sure.
And it sounded like a complete cluster, the way that this was actually brought together. It was early 1970. Some more producers were brought in. Phil Spector, the American producer, was brought in, and he was kind of given free rein to work with the album. He remixed it. He added some strings and some choir to a few tracks. And then also they ended up including Across the Universe and I Me Mine, which were actually recorded in sessions different from the Get Back sessions. Phil then also renamed the album Let It Be, essentially. And it's a little fuzzy to me exactly where the artistic license and creative freedom came into this. How much of a hand Phil Spector had in it, how much of a say the band had. Because, by this point in 1970, the band was already broken up.
Yep, they were done.
They weren't really there anymore. It kind of seemed like maybe they just didn't care as much about the way this record turned out because the sessions left such a bad taste in their mouths to begin with.
Yeah, in addition, I would say that, McCartney heard the final, McCartney there till the end had heard the final cut of Let It Be and hated it. Hated all the string, all the orchestration that went on, specifically with the main single from this record, The Long and Winding Road, and wanted it all scrapped. They essentially said, nope, you're done. We're going to release this as is. And they did. They released a very overproduced version of the Get Back sessions, and a lot of fans, and I'll say I include myself in this, take issue with how this record was released, because it does like when you listen to this record, it fundamentally does not sound like a cohesive Beatles record, and I even argue as a purist it shouldn't have been released. They should have just stopped with Abbey Road.
Yeah, see, I still like the way this album turned out, but if from an artistic standpoint, I can totally understand the frustration of having it be released, not how you want it. As a musician, you typically, if you can't release something how you want it to sound, you just don't release it at all. I think that's just, respecting your own craft. I'm glad that this album was released from a selfish perspective because I like the songs on it.
Oh, for sure. A lot of the songs on here are fantastic.
And I still like the way that it turned out in general, but, going back and hearing the stripped down version of Long and Winding Road, I feel like it is much more potent and speaks emotionally much more to the listener than the more grandiose Phil Spectorized versions.
Winding road that leads to your
But there are a number of good tracks on here. I do think that Across the Universe as a ballad of John's is just beautiful. A gorgeous track. I think that Two of Us is a really good track as
Dig
well.
a Pony.
Yeah, and actually one of my favorite Beatles tracks, I've Got a Feeling. That song I find to be very moving.
I've got a feeling, I think that everybody knows. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
One After 909 is an interesting track because that's actually one that they used to play in their very early days. You can find some really early kind of rough recordings of it where they were, maybe playing it live or kind of practicing it, but they brought it back for these for these sessions, maybe once again in an effort to recapture those early days, to kind of revive an early track of theirs. And of course, the way that they portray it on here is much different than those early recordings and rehearsals of it, but that's just how it goes. Also, of course, the title track, Let It Be, gorgeous song, and while people often, it's easy to focus on the piano and Paul's vocals, I think that George Harrison's guitar solo in that is one of his standouts.
Absolutely one of his standouts.
He just is amazing on that one. And of course, Get Back, the closing track, which then, on Let It Be Naked, I believe they moved to the very beginning of the album, right?
Right.
But that of course is a highlight as well. Just a very good overall rock record, not necessarily a highlight of their career, I don't think, but still a good way to end things.
Yeah, it was a nice parting gift, and I think that it kind of summed up. I think that the move to rename it from Get Back to Let It Be was particularly smart. At that point, the band was over, and you had all of these mourning fans, millions of mourning fans. And if they would have released an album at that point in time called Get Back, then that would have sent the wrong message.
I totally agree.
But renaming it Let It Be, it's like it speaks volumes to where the band was at, and kind of adding that finality to the Beatles and their discography and their body of work.
Yeah, I agree. I think it was a smart choice to rename it because Get Back, they weren't going to get back. They were done. And so Let It Be really brings that closure to it.
Now, from here, the Beatles went on to each have individual solo careers that were quite successful, and we're not going to get into those today. Maybe,
that would be a 10-hour podcast.
Yeah, maybe in subsequent podcasts. We've talked the Beatles to death at this point, but at this point, Tom, what I want to hit on is, you mentioned that the White Album is your favorite Beatles record, but give me your top three.
Okay, so for me, it's White Album, then Sgt. Pepper, and then Revolver. From there, number 4, I'll give Abbey Road. Number 4 is Abbey Road for me, then Magical Mystery Tour, then probably like Help, Hard Day's Night, Rubber Soul. I could give all of them. I
asked for 3 and you give like 8.
Yeah, I know. I couldn't help myself.
Mine is clearly Abbey Road. Very passionate about that being my favorite Beatles record, followed by Sgt. Pepper, then Revolver. So in that order. Then I have to at some point rank the White Album, but I'm not ready to do it yet. So I would go from there. I'd probably say Beatles for Sale or Help.
Gotcha. Yep.
And then jump to the White Album. While I love the White Album and often listen to it, it's really hard to digest in one listen.
It is.
And it's also really hard to listen straight through. And I generally prefer side 1 to side 2.
Yeah.
So, just with the disparity in track quality on that, I tend to not come back to it as much. So I would knock that one down from my own opinion. Fair. I'm curious, those of you out there listening, what are your favorite Beatles records and why? And, this is such an impactful band. I'm curious to the stories that you guys have of how the Beatles have changed your life. Because, like I said at the beginning of this epic 2-part podcast, the Beatles are what I listen to every January to get me through the winter months. Abbey Road is the first album that I played for my son after he was born, and danced with him as this tiny little baby in my arms, like these are emotional experiences. I'm going to raise my kids on the Beatles. I'm wearing a Beatles shirt right now. Like this, it's part of my personality at this point. And I'm sure many of you have stories like that, and I'd love to hear them. All right, guys. Tune in next week for our monthly wrap-up of new albums released in January 2016. Thank you guys for your continued support and participation. Tom and I love all of your comments on our YouTube videos, your Facebook messages, and our emails that we receive from you. Your participation is what makes Velocities in Music possible. As always, thank you so much for everything that you do. I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
And we are Velocities in Music, moving music discussion forward.